went to the seminary in August of 1974. I was a first-year college student. Went to Holy Trinity Seminary, part of the University of Dallas. I'm sure I had all of the normal jitters that a new college student has, moving away from home for the first time, going to a new school, meeting new people, all of the usual things I think that anybody would experience, and I know some will be experiencing here in a relatively short while. Just to assure you, it's really worthwhile to make that, even though you have to transition a little bit to a new life. But besides all of that, I was also entering into the seminary, and the seminary, particularly at that time, had a very strict regimen about how you were to live your life. They told you that a schedule for the day. They told you when to get up, they told you when to pray, they told you when to go to class, they told you when to eat, they told you when to sleep, when to study, when to play. Everything was regimented. And you had to follow. It was a pretty logical set of rules for us to do, but it was very strict. This wasn't an optional thing. It wasn't some goal that you were supposed to strive for. This was something you were expected to do. And one of the things that was on it that I'd never experienced before, besides studying, was something called grand silence. We had grand silence from 11 p.m. at night until the end of prayers the next morning, prayer being either Mass or morning prayer. And I thought, well, it must mean this is some sort of ideal. And they said, no, you have an option here. You can be a seminarian or you can talk, but you cannot do both. And so we had to make that choice. Which one did you really want to do? So they took that grand silence very, very seriously. It could lead to some awkward moments, like going to the bathroom at night and locking yourself out of your room. What do you do then? So I went to the vice rector's door and knocked and just stood there. You locked yourself out of your room, didn't you? So he, I guess, had had that experience before. Never really explained what grand silence was about. Why did we have grand silence? And I thought, well, there was a practical reason for it. That you have 100 young men living together, that could be disruptive. Certainly some percentage of them, maybe your night owls, are going to be up and chatting and talking and doing whatever young people do late at night. They said this would eliminate a lot of problems and could make for a more peaceful place. I think that was certainly a part of the motivation for it. But it really harkened back to something different, which was the monastic life. Much of our order of day, I think, reflected a monastic spirituality. And in a monastery, they maintained a great deal of silence, much more than what we experience in the seminary. But they demanded that they live their life in silence. The whole world seemed to be immersed in silence. You happen to see that great, movie documentary, Into the Great Silence, about this Carthusian monastery in Belgium. Really powerful movie it's not an action-packed movie, but a very quiet movie. It's very silent, that you experience the silence of their life, and yet it's very moving. And I think one of the purposes of that, the primary purpose, is that they recognized intuitively that silence is a form of prayer. That in order to enter into prayer, however you wanted to define it, you needed to have some form of silence. That is silence in the world around you, and of course silence within your own heart. That the silence had to be in both places. But you needed the atmosphere of silence, and that in this silence you hear the voice of God. Father Thomas Keating, I've quoted this before, quotes St. John of the Cross, who says that silence is God's first language. Silence is God's first language. Everything else, he said, is a bad translation. And so we enter into silence, and silence in some ways is almost the presence of God himself. That there's something about something, you can't prove that, of course. I can't say, well, don't you see it, experience it now? But silence can be a kind of a sacramental presence of God. There's something awe-inspiring. Why do people talk about maybe walking in the woods or going in the mountains and that sort of thing? Certainly it's the beauty that is around them, but it's also the silence. It's the quiet there. It's the absence of noise that seems to be filled in with the presence of Christ. How do we find the presence of God in our life, and where is that presence? Well, I would say that the presence of God is not something that comes to us directly, but indirectly in an immediate way. We like things to be very direct. When we have a direct experience of something, that we know it and it's very immediate to us. I'm directly experiencing you, you're directly experiencing me. There isn't necessarily anything in between us. But that's not the way we experience God. God comes to us in an indirect fashion, just the way I was trying to describe silence here as one of those experiences of God that is indirect, not directly. In fact, doesn't Scripture say somewhere, I tried to look this up, I didn't find it, but no one can see the face of God and live. Because to see the face of God in a direct fashion would, of course, put you into heaven itself. This is the experience of heaven, is to see God face to face, the beatific vision, as it is described by the scholastic philosophers. But we don't experience God that way. We experience him indirectly. So we see Christ, see God, present to us in the beauty of nature that is around us, the beautiful things that are around us. Somehow that reflects the presence of God to us. Or we see God in the goodness of other people, in their generosity, in their kindness, in the joy that's in a child, and that sort of thing. This sparks something, I think, within us that speaks to us of the presence of God. And by faith, we believe that Christ is present to us, what we celebrate today in this feast of the body and blood of Christ, the presence of Christ in the sacrament of his body and blood, in the bread and wine. That is, again, I think this is kind of critical to understand. It's not a direct experience of Christ, but an indirect and mediated experience of him. And this seems to me to be one of those critical things that we have to have in our spiritual life. And to be a people of faith is to recognize that the experience of God doesn't come to us directly. Maybe there are moments that we say that we are overwhelmed by the presence of God. Even that is somewhat indirect for us, but there are those privileged moments for people where they directly experience God. But for the most part, God comes to us in an indirect and mediated fashion. We say in the body and blood of Christ that it is truly present. Christ is really present. It's the Eucharistic species. And this real presence of Christ is a very beautiful and unique way that we have him in our life. But unless we can appreciate and accept those indirect ways of having his presence, just like we have indirect presence of people in our life and other things, this indirect but real presence is so vital for our spiritual life. This past January, I decided again to take a silent retreat. Happened to take it simultaneously with the other priests of the diocese who weren't on a silent retreat, and at first it was very difficult for me to enter into the silence, and I heard and saw that they were chatting and being in communion with one another, and everybody wants a direct experience. It's more fun, I guess, to have that. And yet, as I accepted the silence of the situation, I came to appreciate it, and by the end, really didn't want to let it go, because that silence of God spoke to me in a very special way. We hear the silent presence, I think, of Christ in the bread and wine that speaks to us in a profound and real way.